You're listening to Stories from Montreal, a podcast to highlight the voices and work of Concordia University's undergraduate Sociology and Anthropology department. All of our guests have been featured authors in our academic journal of the same name, Stories from Montreal. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous land. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which we gather today. Teotihuacan, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and all peoples within the Montreal community. I am your host, Olivia, and today I will be chatting with Philippe about his paper entitled Impacts of Government Policies on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, the Ganawagi Case. Philippe is a master's student in Criminology at the Université de Montréal. He has a bachelor's degree at Concordia University with a major in First People Studies and a minor in Sociology. Philippe did a student exchange in Rovaniemi in Finland in the Arctic Studies program. He also worked with Inuit communities in Nunavik and Makivik, as well as being involved with Indigenous organizations in Montreal. He has published articles and organized many events to foster better relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. He is not Indigenous and grew up in Teotihuacan, or Montreal, and his main area of research is family violence in Indigenous communities. Welcome, Philippe.
Thank you very much for introducing me. And yes, I'll talk a bit about my paper that I submitted. So it was a paper that was coming from a group project in a class called Globalization and Indigenous Peoples. So that was part of my major in First People Studies at Concordia. So we wanted to look at the food systems in Indigenous communities, and I focused more specifically on their historical context. So how historically the government policies impacted the food sovereignty. So I wanted to look at what was the impact in Ganawagi, in the context of Ganawagi, but also in other parts of Canada. So I looked at the ways control and regulation of the food systems was done by government. So for example, I was looking at the permit system that was limiting the access to Indigenous people to, for example, agriculture products. So they had to ask to sell the products. There was restriction also on modern tools. So those types of regulation were the impact, and the goal was in a way assimilation, and the impact was to limit their faculty and their means to produce. And it was seen by non-Indigenous as competition. So it was to favor more non-Indigenous farmers, agriculture, that kind of thing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for submitting it. That paper was very interesting. You mentioned that you chose to study the community of Ganawagi. Why is that?
Yes, so it was some of our group members were from Ganawagi, and in the classes we underlined the importance of looking at the local history. So as we are in Jojagi, Montreal, which is a land that, and Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk, are still custodian of the land. So it was important for us to look at the local history. So that's why the case of Ganawagi was very interesting. And it's also a context which is different from other parts of Canada, because the people from Ganawagi, they were used to agriculture. They were traditionally, agriculture was part of their food systems. So it was interesting to see specifically in Ganawagi how the Indian Act and how other type of regulation had impacted the community of Ganawagi, and had an impact on the relation of Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk. It has an impact on their relation with the land, basically.
And when you tell me, that they had agriculture and it was part of their pre-existing society, can you sort of elaborate on that a little bit? Would it be what we would consider as, Euro-Canadian or colonial agriculture, or was it a little bit different? Or
For sure, it was different, and evolved throughout the centuries, and population were moving. But what I could say about it is that it was a type of agriculture that was for I don't want to say survival, but it was for their own means. They could do trading, but basically it was mainly corn that was used, but also squash and other type of food. But the way it was done, they were also changing places. For example, after 10, 15, 20 years, they would change. They would move the community to make sure that the land had time to come back to. They didn't want to kind of abuse of the land. They wanted to make sure the land was able to give the necessary, and when it was kind of enough, they were able to change. So it was for sure a different type of agriculture, but and it was not only agriculture. There was also hunting and fishing. It was a complex food system that was impacted, which was not fully understood by Europeans, and these misunderstandings were very important when it was the time to make regulation by the European after colonization.
Mhm. And before you mentioned, so for people who aren't familiar with the Indian Act, it was an act passed by the government, right, who were trying to regulate basically almost every aspect of Indigenous life. Can you talk a little bit more about the Indian Act? What was its goals, the impacts that it had on Indigenous peoples, and then more specifically for your research?
Yes. So the Indian Act, which is still in place, was enacted in 1876. But the Indian Act was kind of a gathering of other acts that were in place before. So it's not the beginning, but it's another step in the goal of assimilation. And there's this idea of that the Indian, quote unquote, have to be like Europeans. So the perspective and the goal of this act was to create rules and create a context where the European were able to colonize in a better way. And we talk about residential school. We talk about things like the reserve and the band council. So it has an impact on many aspects of Indigenous lives. But I was looking more specifically on the impact of Indian Act on the food system. So, for example, on the land and agriculture, there's many instances where we see that the Indian Act was used to give land to non-indigenous people. For example, if the land was considered as not used, it could be attributed to non-indigenous farmers or other people to make sure that the indigenous land was still shrinking. So that was one of the consequences of the Indian Act, and also enfranchisement. So basically making sure that the indigenous people were losing their quote unquote Indian status. So if someone had a parcel of land and was, for example, going to war, getting a university degree, they would lose their Indian status, and their land would be considered as non-indigenous. So that was the type of thing the Indian Act could do, and there were many changes. But the Indian Act is still in place today, and these impacts are still seen nowadays.
You said they're still seen. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? For example, in contemporary times, what does the Indian Act still regulate, and what does it still influence for Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, it's important to understand that it's not all indigenous that are under the Indian Act. For example, Inuit and Métis are not under the Indian Act, and some indigenous nations sign convention. For example, the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. So the Cree, some nations have other type of regulation that are applied, but in general, the Indian Act is still in place, and it regulates, for example, the Band Council. So the Band Council, it's the governance. So they imposed election. It's not a system that was coming from indigenous communities. So that would be an example that's still in place.
Okay. And in your paper, I saw that you were talking about specifically the impact that the Indian Act had on women and how it impacted women differently than men. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. So it's also in the perspective of the European. So this misunderstanding was also in there. There was misunderstanding regarding the role of women in indigenous culture, but specifically in the context of Ganawagi, there was this misunderstanding about the role of women in agriculture and in the society in general. So, for example, a woman would lose her status if she was marrying a non-Indian status person. So basically, they were not recognizing their rights for the equivalent. And in terms of agriculture, their role was maybe different from the male, but they were considered as fragile and considered as more weak. So they were imposing with the Indian Act, but also with the other regulation and their interpretation. They were imposing this
Mm-hmm.
view of women as inferior, even if it was not originally or traditionally part of the community of Ganawagi and of most indigenous communities.
It's interesting what you're saying in the sense that they were imposing, European values and views of women on Indigenous women, even though they weren't necessarily already present in society. So that's very interesting. In terms of the time period you chose for your study, right? So for people who haven't read it yet, he chose or the group actually chose 1800s to the 1900s. Why did you choose that particular time period? Did the Indian Act have a more severe impact during that time period? Or was it when there was more of a change in the agricultural practices? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yes. So I focused more on the historical part, and we wanted to address this time frame because, first of all, it's the beginning of the Confederation, Canadian Confederation, as we know it now, and basically there was a lot of changes. Usually, we define most changes after the War of 1812. So after this war, there was a power shift where Indigenous people were not seen as important in the European perspective, and it was an intensification of the idea of assimilation, and Indigenous people were seen as more useless, and there was this idea of assimilating them in the European culture in a way, in the white world. So this period is very very interesting because there was a lot of changes. So with the Indian Act, but also with other regulation, and there was more. It was an intensification of the involvement in indigenous lives. And we talk about the Ganawagi, but in other communities, the impact of the government also was more important. And for example, there was community were still nomad in the beginning of the 19th centuries, and with it was like kind of another step in the colonization process. So that was this time frame that I wanted to focus on because it was a very important period, and the impacts of this period can be seen in the decades that were following and even today. So this relation between those changes and their impacts are very important.
Thank you. And I'm looking at your essay right now, and on page 1 to 2, you have a quote. I'm going to read it to you. It says, "These people would need approval of Indian agents to sell agricultural products." Can you expand a little bit about that? What did you mean by approval of Indian agents, and why did they need approval to sell their products?
Yes, yes. So this specific part, it was specifically for, as they said, Western Indians. So the Indian Act or in the regulation were sometimes applied for specific groups. So that's also important to understand. But the role of the Indian agent was very very mm, big in the daily life of the indigenous community. So he was because he was often a man. The Indian agent had a lot of power, It was kind of representing the government and the minister, and that was giving the approval. So signing the permit, or for example with the pass system, or you can go out of the community and giving approval. So this process of asking a white person to give approval to indigenous people for doing basically normal things, that was very common in the law, and specifically for agriculture, it was a way to regulate and to make sure the white European government was controlling what was going on, and one of the goal was to make sure there was less competition, so there was more place for non-indigenous farmers, So that was one of the way the government was using the regulation to control the agriculture products and yeah, this industry.
Interesting. So the agent was basically an indigenous person babysitter, right? So they were basically infantilizing indigenous people and just using their power to, like you said, use and allow basic everyday actions to occur. Would you say that would be correct, or?
We can say obviously there's always different type of agent and the way yes, the law are written, but the way they are applied can vary a lot. But if they wanted to apply the law, they had a lot of power, and their power was very important, and it can be seen, yeah, as a way of infantilization, because the indigenous people had not the same. They were kind of considered as minor in the eyes of the law in terms of their power, and always have to ask other people. That's It's clearly different from what the non-indigenous people had as rights. So for sure there's a big differences, and there was also resistance. There was also resistance from indigenous communities when we talk about many things that were in for it, even residential school or the band council. There was resistance, and even if the law was written in a way, in reality it could be also different. Yeah.
And I'm still on page 2. You wrote that, and you mentioned this earlier, that the method was used of controlling food systems. It was suggested to reduce competition for non-indigenous people. Was that, and I don't know if you can speak to this because this was obviously a long time ago in terms of this occurrence, but did it actually work? And was that actually the goal, or was the goal just to sort of gain control and assimilate indigenous peoples? Was there really a competition here, or do you know what I mean?
I would say that if we go back in kind of the mindset, we are in the time of expansion of Canada. So Canada began in more the Quebec, Ontario region, but specifically Ottawa and Montreal, Quebec nowadays. So this expansion in the west with the railway, it's really to put the indigenous people in reserve and give place to newcomers. So they were there, and in terms of competition, what Canada was doing was telling newcomers and immigrants from other countries, come in Canada, there's free lands for you. We're going to give you these lands, even though they were owned by, I mean, they were the property of indigenous people, but that was not recognized. So they were using these kind of regulation to make sure that there was more space for non-indigenous people.
Okay, and I noticed also going through your paper and when I was reading it the first time that there was sort of two types of sources that you use for this paper. The first one is, academic papers. Some of the authors are Indigenous or have worked with Indigenous peoples, and then the other kind of source is government sources. So from Gouvernement Canada or from the Department of Indigenous Studies, which is not call that, but I'm going to call it that for sake of its name. Can you talk a little bit about how the information and how different the approach was for both sources? So if you were to compare government sources to academic sources.
Yes, yes. For me, it was interesting to look back a bit more in the archives, also in the reports from these Indian agents, looking at their vocabulary and the way they saw indigenous people, and for sure we can see that there's misunderstanding, and there's a way of looking at indigenous people that is interesting, but when we compare it to, for example, more contemporary and academic papers, we see that there's a big differences, and I would say they have different angles basically. So for me, it's important to have this diversity of sources, and when I look at, for example, at academic sources that are more recent, they can give us an overview, a more general idea than for example archive that are specific to 1 year and one report in this particular year. and the government documentation maybe that's more contemporary. It always depends what's the sources. But for example, the Royal Commission of on Aboriginal people, it was done by the government of Canada, but the commissioner, one of them was Indigenous, the other one was non-Indigenous. So it always depends on the source, but each source has its perspective, its angle, and it is different for sure.
And we mentioned earlier, and you mentioned in your bio that you had studied in the Arctic Studies program in Finland. You had also studied in Nunavik, and also in Makjavik. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there? Can you talk a little bit about how it has impacted your area of interest, your area of study, and also what general impact it had on you and what you learned?
Yes, yes. So when I came to Concordia, I knew I wanted to do a student exchange. So I began to look at the different programs, and I wanted to learn more from other Arctic people, other Arctic states, because Canada is part of the Arctic Council, for example. So I looked at the different programs that are offered, and I was really interested about this Arctic Studies program in Rovaniemi in Finland, which is north of Finland, on the Arctic Circle. And they are really specialized in Arctic studies, and they have an Arctic Center and Arctic Museum. So it was a very, very interesting experience to learn more also from an international perspective. So learning from researchers and academics that are working with Indigenous people, not only in Canada or Finland, but also in Russia, for example, or other with other Indigenous communities. And in this region, it's more the Sami people, which are the Indigenous people of the region. So I got to learn a lot about the Sami people, and I had the opportunity to travel also in Sami territory and go and learn more about those people. So when I came back to Canada to continue my master, that's for sure things that I keep with me, and that are very, very interesting. And for the other, I worked in Makhovik and Puvurnituk for 2 summers as a, they call it the counselor, but basically it was a day camp with Inuit youth. So that was also a very important experience, and it was very interesting to work in the community and contribute. It was for the development and for the well-being of the youth. So we wanted to create activities, and it was in partnership with Nunavik and Nunavut government. So it was a very nice experience, and all these experiences culminate in my desire to contribute more in the field of Indigenous studies in the way that interests me. And now I decided to take more in criminological angle. So that's why I decided to do my master around overcoming family violence. So learning from stories from Indigenous people who were able to go beyond and overcome family violence, even though all the trauma related to colonization that we know. I wanted to learn more about the success stories and see what we can learn from these positive experiences.
And one question I had for you was, you went from a major in First People Studies and a minor in Sociology to Criminology. Is there a relation between both? Do you use your bachelor's and your master's? And also, can you name for an instance in which Sociology or First People Studies brought you something to your master's?
Yeah, and it's interesting because my first class at Concordia and my first paper I submitted was about overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canadian prison. So the fact that around 30% of inmates in Canada are Indigenous, even though if they represent around 5% of the population. So since the beginning of my studies at Concordia, that was this criminological angle was interesting me, and I did also a paper about gangs, Indigenous gangs in the prairies in a class called Juvenile Crime and Delinquency in sociology class. So there's for sure a lot of links to do with between these fields, and the criminology is related to sociology, to law, to political science, but also to First People studies, as Indigenous people are present in the criminal system. So there's for sure a lot of links between the programs, and I decided to do this major and minor, because for me it had a lot of sense, and it was a continuation, and in my thoughts and in my the project I wanted to do. Criminology was something that I wanted to push further, even though I haven't done a lot of criminology in my bachelor at Concordia, and that's why I had also to do a preparation year before entering the master. So make sure there's a when we change program, sometimes that's something we have to do, like 1 year preparation. So that's what I'm doing right now, actually. So it's a 2 year program, but I have to add 1 year of preparation for the master.
And I think the last question I have for you today, thank you, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us. It was really great. And I really enjoyed this discussion. But the last question I would have for you today is, for all the students out there who are non-Indigenous as you are and who want to study indigeneity in Canada, for whether it is criminology or society or culture or anything like that, do you have a last piece of wisdom or a piece of advice for students who are non-Indigenous, who want to enter this world and want to learn about it in a positive way and affect potentially positive change?
I've been told a lot of time that it's very, very important to listen. That's the first thing. Listen to stories. Listen to what Indigenous people have to say, because they are the expert of their own life, and I think that's the most important thing that I would want to stress, and look at what's going on, and also the impact of our own our own actions, and it's more than just good faith and good intention. So we have to make sure that we understand the impact that we can have, and it begins by understanding what's going on right now, what happened in our history, and learning from Indigenous nation, learning from the diversity of Indigenous people in Canada, and even beyond. So I would say that I encourage people to open their eyes, and consider Indigenous perspective, because Indigenous perspective are everywhere in every field, and there's always Indigenous people are everywhere, and they're part of our society. So that would be what I would like people to remember.
That was very well said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it was a pleasure.
To read Philippe's or any of our other featured authors' works, be sure to check out SASU's Facebook page or Instagram for more information. Stories from Montreal was produced with support from the Concordia Student Union, the Sociology and Anthropology Student Union, and CJLO radio station. It was hosted by me, Olivia, and edited by Marie Figuereo. Our sound design is by Malte Leander and artwork by Ali Brown. You can catch our show on the CJLO airways at cjlo.com or on their channel at 1690 AM every Wednesday at 4 p.m. You can also listen to us anywhere you like to stream podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.